You go out, you're floating on a raft, and all of a sudden you look up and you're like, oh, I am a mile away from where I was. Drift is one of those things that you don't quite notice it till you really put your head up. And I think that's what we try and, communicate to folks is you're not going to see it. It's not going to feel like you teleported. It's going to feel like you're just doing your day to day. And when you look up, all of a sudden, you haven't been thinking about the buyer the whole time.
Welcome to the Buyer-Centric OS. Buyer-Centric OS, a system for revolutionary customer experience. With your hosts, Andy Halko and Tony Zayas. This show helps you turn guesswork into growth by putting your buyer at the center of everything.
Welcome to today's episode. Everybody, we're going to be talking about lessons. So, Andy, a question I have is, do you remember a moment when you thought something would land with the buyer, and then you realized later it was like way off?
Yeah, I mean, I think that happens all the time. That especially we do something like ads, right, in marketing, and we're creating these great ad copy headlines internally. You think, wow, this is like so, it will capture the attention. You put the ad out there and nothing. And on the reverse side, it's funny because you can test ads and you don't know if you feel good about the visual or the message, but you get a lot of results. And so I think that's, comes back to that whole thing of we aren't our buyers, right? Which is what we started this whole discussion about with, the buyer-centric operating system is we aren't our buyers. So our ideas, as much as we might think they're great, that doesn't mean that they actually resonate with the person that you're trying to influence.
So how would you explain the concept of the buyer lens to, let's say, a CEO who really thinks that they get their customer, but in reality, they don't?
Yeah, I mean, the buyer lens is part of the operating system. We talked about the maturity model, where you are. We're going to be talking more about the flywheel and the framework. The lens is really how we look at our buyer through their perspective. And it's kind of almost a mirror in some ways too, that you're trying to just understand them. And so I think the buyer lens is anything that you do, any decision that you make should be viewed through the buyer lens. And so it's really about whether your product team is working on a feature. Are they looking through their lens, or are they looking through the buyer's lens at what that feature should be, because that's actually what's going to be impactful. The marketing team, are they looking through their lens, that ad we just talked about, or are they looking through the buyer's lens? And you really go through all of those different areas: sales, delivery, service. If you're looking at it through your lens, there's a good chance that you might miss the mark. If you're looking at it through the buyer's lens, then there's a much better opportunity to influence, engage, convince the people that you are trying to do that with.
And it's a natural tendency, right? We're always going to think from our own perspective first. So it really is a practice of getting in there. First of all, understanding your buyer and all of the people in the buying decision-making process. But in the book, you define 3 different modes that I think are very helpful in keeping this in mind of how to actually begin to practice kind of using that buyer lens. You want to take us through those?
Yeah, there's really first the reflective mode. It's before you make decisions. So again, prior to creating a feature, prior to launching an ad, that you're going through this reflective mode to really understand the buyer and think about what their needs are. Then there's diagnostic mode. That's much more driven towards in execution. We're actually capturing information to understand, are we drifting away from the buyer, or are we staying aligned to them? And then the final one is really retrospective mode. that we are now coming back and we're saying we launched this feature, but we don't see people are using it. What are we learning from that? Or we've launched this ad and we haven't gotten any clicks. What are we learning from that? And so reflective is so important, because before you do anything, you really should step back and say, am I looking through the buyer's lens? Diagnostic is important because, while you're in the middle of doing things, it's really easy to drift away from that buyer alignment. You may have started in reflective mode, building a feature for your product where you really thought about the buyer, but as you're actually like designing it and you're coding it, all of a sudden you start shifting into your mindset and what you want. And then retrospective is really that ability to step back after and say, did we stay aligned? And if we didn't, what do we have to do better next time?
Stepping into that like during execution phase, because I think it makes sense to, before you launch something, to, the first step in the process to be reflective, that makes sense. And then after the fact to think about it as well. But to me, the diagnostic mode, I think that one is so crucial. And you mentioned the term drift. What does that drift look like in real terms? And like, how would someone realize that is happening?
Yeah. Drift, I use the term a lot, right? Like our goal in all of this buyer-centric operating system is to be aligned, to be in step with our buyers. And the drift is really this idea that, a lot of times when we pull away from the buyer, it's not one big thing, right? It's not this huge, like, oh, all of a sudden we care about our customers and tomorrow don't care about them at all. That's not a reality. What a reality is that we slowly drift away. And what that really means is that, again, with the products, we start and we think about the customer, but we've talked about those four forces. The drift is that our red tape in the organization, other people coming into the process with their opinions, it slowly drifts us away. One opinion and says, change that word, all of a sudden can get us to drift away, or our own bias and like, oh, well, that didn't work 10 years ago and I'm going to do this. It's a matter of micro decisions that end up pulling us away from the alignment that we've created. And so within the operating system, we really look at, okay, well, we're building systems to be aligned and in step with the buyer. And within those systems, we also want to have activity that help us stay away from drift. Because I think a lot of companies, what you think about with drift is, imagine being in the ocean, you go out, you're floating on a raft, and all of a sudden you look up and you're like, oh, I am a mile away from where I was. Drift is one of those things that you don't quite notice it till you really put your head up. And I think that's what we try and, communicate to folks is, you're not going to see it. It's not going to feel like you teleported. It's going to feel like you're just doing your day to day. And when you look up, all of a sudden, you haven't been thinking about the buyer the whole time.
Now, in terms of the lens, where does like segmentation come into play?
Yeah, and it might be good. We have this little graphic that we can bring up. I think just a good place to kind of talk about this. We really look at the buyer experience gap and, what your buyer experience is versus how your team operates. And so really what we try and look at is this, what is the buyer's reality? And so the lens helps us kind of see through this gap, where for the buyer's reality, they're dealing with real things, like real pain, like their process is broken. They get repetitive complaints from other people on their team. Onboarding is clunky, or there's market pressures where we're talking about changes in regulations or budgets that fluctuate, strategic shifts. There's a new executive that comes in. These are things that, if you think about it, are the reality of your buyer, the things that they're dealing with every day. And the challenge is, for our team's reality, is that sometimes it it doesn't align with that, and we're not seeing from their perspective. We're not thinking about, oh, how does that new executive affect their job and the decisions that they're now going to make, or that merger. Or we're not thinking about like internally their budgets are fluctuating a lot, so how do we adapt to that? We're typically thinking on the team side, timelines dictate decisions. We've set a timeline for launching this product. We're going to do it whether it's right or not because we've set that deadline. We've got fire drills that all of a sudden something pops up and we just have to solve it. We don't hand things off well between, marketing or sales to our delivery team. So there's all these things that we're doing in our reality that end up being very difficult to connect the dots between what the true reality of the buyer is.
Something that we've talked about, kind of the traditional way of developing personas, they do not account for all those moving pieces and kind of fire drills and things. And that's something that makes that aspect challenging. I think, is there a second part of this graphic that we want to dive into?
There's, what do we look like where we now align and close that gap? And so it really is about, getting back to some of these things we talked about in the lens is reflect before asking. So this is a part of that reflective mode is that, or reflect before acting. How would the buyer see this, right? So if we are launching an ad campaign, before we actually hit that publish button, are we stepping back and reflecting and saying, truly, how is this person going to view it? And again, view it in terms of these things up here, like market pressures or emotional drivers. Like we're actually reflecting on it before we, create that feature, launch that ad campaign, send that proposal. We're always reflecting. Diagnose in motion, which we talked about in that diagnostic mode. Drift is detected early, not after the fact. And so what we're doing is we're measuring what we're doing and we're saying, okay, are we still aligned? Have we made any changes to what we're doing that's pulling us away? Learn after outcomes is that now retrospective mode, shared buyer reality, one view of the buyer across all teams. This is kind of new from what we were talking about earlier, but having one source of truth within your entire team, marketing, sales, product, of who your audience is, how they think, what they care about, and that each team doesn't have a completely different view of who they're targeting and what influences them. Segmented, personalized execution. So, that one size fits all thinking. If we have campaigns that we're launching for a CIO versus a director of security, let's say, those are two very different things. And so we really have to make sure that when we're trying to align and we're bringing this gap together, that we're not thinking of our audience as one big group of people. Dynamic buyer understanding, tracking in real-time sentiment. This is really the scenario that we have to be gathering feedback. A lot of organizations, I think, love the idea of feedback, but they really don't make it part of their culture. Right. And then that moves naturally into cultural buyer obsession. Every role, every meeting, every deliverable is filtered through that lens, that it's not something that the marketing team is really buyer aligned and they really think about it. But the product team, they just love to innovate and create cool features. And so it's really something that has to be truly, cultural and across the whole organization.
And I think this was a really helpful infographic here that kind of walks through all of these pieces. And just a heads up, if you're tuning in, right now, a lot of this stuff might be the first time you're really considering some of this sentiment and detail. In our next episode, we're going to be diving into the buyer framework that really moves from concept more into systemization. So I think that'll help for taking all this information and implementing it. But I was going to ask Andy, I know a lot of times we try to stick to pure, good content here, but I think it's a good opportunity for us to talk a little bit about Buyer Twin and why that was built and kind of how that fits in particular here when we're looking at the buyer lens.
Yeah, I mean, we built Buyer Twin at buyertwin.com, which is a software that allows you to clone your target buyer and create a really accurate viewpoint of them and then be able to interact with them. So you can have conversations, ask them a question, they'll answer. You can upload images, or you can give them web pages and say, hey, tell me what you think of this. You can brainstorm messaging with them. It is really a tool for that upfront reflective mode that you can, before you create a product feature, you can go and have a conversation about would they get value out of it? What things do they really need to see within that feature to feel like it's going to be successful? If you're in marketing, you can upload your landing page and say, hey, operations supervisor, is this something that actually would engage and convince you to move forward? And so we really have developed this platform that creates one shared truth for teams and has the ability to interact and be reflective so that before you launch or you do anything, you're able to actually ask your target buyer for feedback and make changes before you put it out in the world.
Powerful stuff. And I will say that Buyer Twin was built because of the complexity of everything we just talked about on today's show. And there not really being a solution out there to kind of figure out how to manage all those pieces and parts to be able to see through that buyer lens. So really cool tool. I recommend you check it out, buyertwin.com. There is a free version available. So check it out. And then again, next week, we will be back with more diving into that buyer framework where we'll take this conceptual and help you systematize and implement all these things that we've been talking about. So thanks, Andy. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We will see you guys next time.
Thanks for tuning into the Buyer-Centric OS. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and grab your copy of the Buyer-Centric Operating System by Andy Halko, available now on Amazon. For more tools and insights, visit andyhalko.com.